The summer heat was relentless, pressing down with a weight that seemed to stifle everything, even thought. I was kneeling in the garden behind my father's house, the earth dry and crumbly between my fingers as I pulled at the stubborn weeds that had crept into the flower beds. The sun was high overhead, its rays filtering through the tall oak trees that framed the yard. It was peaceful in a way, the solitude offering a chance to clear my mind. I didn't hear her approach at first. My stepmother, Elaine, moved with a quiet grace that made her presence seem almost ethereal. She had married my father 6 years ago when I was just finishing high school. She was nothing like I had expected, a stark contrast to my late mother, both in appearance and demeanor. Where my mother had been soft-spoken and reserved, Elaine was vivacious, her laughter filling the house like sunlight. Her auburn hair caught the light in a way that made it look almost like fire, and her eyes, a piercing green, seemed to see more than most. "Tom," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough to pull me from my thoughts. I turned, startled, to see her standing at the edge of the garden, a glass of lemonade in her hand. She wore a loose sundress that swayed gently in the breeze, the fabric clinging to her figure in a way that made it impossible not to notice. "Thought you could use this," she said, stepping closer and holding out the glass. "Thanks," I muttered, taking it from her and gulping down half the contents in one go. The lemonade was tart and refreshing, the coolness a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. "You've been out here for hours," she remarked, crouching down beside me. "You'll give yourself heat stroke if you're not careful." I shrugged, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. "Just trying to finish before the sun gets any hotter." She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the flower beds. "Your father always said you were stubborn. I guess he was right." Her words carried a teasing warmth, but there was something else in her tone, something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, unsure of how to respond, and turned back to the task at hand. She didn't leave, though, her presence lingering at my side like a shadow. I was acutely aware of her, of the way her dress shifted as she moved, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, confused. "Miss what?" "Your apartment? Your life in the city?" she clarified. "I know this must feel like a step backward." "It's not so bad," I said, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, I hadn't wanted to come back, not to this house, not to the memories it held. But after losing my job, I didn't have much choice. My father had been the one to suggest it, and Elaine had welcomed me with open arms, her kindness genuine, but tinged with something I couldn't quite name. She studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to read the thoughts I wasn't voicing. "You can be honest with me, she said softly. "I won't judge." I hesitated, my hands stilling in the dirt. "It's different," I admitted, "but I appreciate you letting me stay." Her smile returned, softer this time, and she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against my shoulder. The touch was brief but deliberate, and I felt a strange jolt of warmth where her fingers had been. "Family takes care of each other," she said simply. She didn't leave the garden after that, instead settling onto the wooden bench that overlooked the yard. I went back to pulling weeds, though my focus wavered under the weight of her gaze. I could feel her watching me, her presence an anchor that kept my thoughts from drifting too far. "You've grown up," she said after a while, her tone thoughtful. I glanced at her, wiping the sweat from my brow again. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're not the same awkward teenager I remember. You've matured." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. "I guess that happens." Her laughter was soft, almost musical, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "I suppose it does." There was something in the way she said it, an undercurrent that made my pulse quicken. I forced myself to focus on the weeds, on the repetitive motion of pulling and discarding, but the air between us felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. When I finally finished, the flower beds looked neat and tidy, the soil free of the invasive growth that had threatened to overtake it. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and turned to find Elaine watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "You've done a wonderful job," she said, standing as well. "You're good with your hands." Her comment was innocent enough, but there was a flicker in her gaze, a momentary hesitation that made me wonder if she meant more than the words conveyed. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Don't work too hard," she said, her tone soft but firm. "You need to take care of yourself too." I nodded, unable to find my voice, and she smiled, her fingers lingering for a moment before she turned and walked back toward the house. I watched her go, my chest tight with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. The afternoon passed in a blur. I found myself retreating to my room after a quick shower, the coolness of the sheets a relief against my sunburned skin. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of the garden, the way Elaine had looked at me, the warmth of her touch, the undercurrent of something unspoken that lingered in the air between us. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into her words and gestures. She was my stepmother, after all, a figure who had always been kind, welcoming, and supportive, but nothing more. Yet the way she had lingered in the garden, the way her gaze had softened when she spoke to me, it felt different now, charged in a way I couldn't explain. By the time the sun began to set, the house had grown quiet. My father was away on a business trip, leaving just Elaine and me under the same roof. I heard the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen and decided to join her, hoping the company would distract me from the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. Elaine stood at the sink, her back to me, humming softly to herself as she washed the plates from dinner. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose braid that exposed the elegant curve of her neck. The sight of her caught me off guard, and I paused in the doorway, unsure of whether to announce my presence or retreat. She must have sensed me there, because she turned, her smile lighting up when she saw me. "Hey," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "I was wondering if you'd gone to bed early." I shook my head, stepping into the room. "Just needed a break after the garden. It was hotter out there than I expected." She chuckled, her laughter warm and rich. "You worked hard. It looks beautiful now. Your dad will be impressed when he sees it." "Thanks," I said, leaning against the counter. I didn't mind, it was relaxing. She raised an eyebrow, her smile teasing. "Relaxing? That's not what I call pulling weeds in the sun." I shrugged, feeling a small smile tug at my lips. Guess I needed something to focus on. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, her expression softening. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's nice to lose yourself in something simple." The air between us shifted again, the light-hearted banter giving way to a quieter, more intimate atmosphere. I watched as she turned back to the sink, her movements deliberate, as she rinsed the last plate and set it in the drying rack. "You've been good for this house," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I frowned, caught off guard by her words. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. "It's been a while since this place felt alive," she admitted. "Since your dad and I got married, it's been quiet, peaceful but lonely at times." Her honesty struck a chord in me, and I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm glad I could help," I said finally. Her smile deepened, and she stepped closer, her eyes searching mine. "You've brought something back, Tom, and I'm grateful for that." The weight of her gaze sent a shiver through me, and I felt my pulse quicken. She was standing close now, close enough that I could see the faint freckles on her cheeks, the way her lashes cast delicate shadows against her skin. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," I said softly, unsure of why the words came out. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face. "Complicated," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think it's that simple." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat as her hand reached out, brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was fleeting, but it left a trail of warmth in its wake, and I felt my breath hitch. "Elaine," I began, though I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. She held my gaze, her eyes filled with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Tom," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor I could see in her hands. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." "I don't," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I don't know what this is." She smiled faintly, her hand lingering on my arm. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I searched for an answer. But the truth was, I didn't have one, not one that made sense anyway. All I knew was that the warmth of her hand, the softness of her voice, the way she looked at me, it felt like gravity, pulling me towards something I couldn't resist. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It does." Her smile widened, and for a moment neither of us moved, the space between us charged with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Then, slowly, she stepped back, her hand slipping from my arm as she turned toward the doorway. "Good night, Tom," she said, her voice soft but steady. I watched her go, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to follow her, to bridge the distance she had just created. But another part of me, one that was quieter but no less insistent, told me to let her go, to let the moment settle. As the door clicked shut behind her, I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. I knew something had changed between us, something that couldn't be undone. But what that meant, or where it would lead, I had no idea. The night stretched long and restless, filled with a tangle of thoughts I couldn't escape. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over. Elaine's touch, her words, the look in her eyes, it all swirled together. A kaleidoscope of emotions I couldn't untangle. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that her kindness was just that kindness. But the way my chest tightened every time I thought of her smile told me otherwise. By the time the sun rose, I had barely slept. I stumbled downstairs, bleary-eyed, expecting the house to be quiet. Instead, I found Elaine in the garden, crouched over the flower beds I'd cleared the day before. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the morning sun, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. I hesitated in the doorway, watching her. The way she moved, graceful, deliberate, drew me in, and before I realized it, I was stepping outside, the cool morning air a welcome relief against my skin. She looked up as I approached, her face lighting up in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "Morning," she said, her voice warm. "Morning," I replied, stuffing my hands into my pockets. "You're up early," she smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Thought I'd make myself useful." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension from the night before still lingered, an invisible thread connecting us, even as we danced around it. I crouched beside her, my fingers brushing against the soil as I reached for a stray weed. You didn't have to do this," I said, glancing at her. "I would have taken care of it." She shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I don't mind. Besides, I like the quiet in the mornings." "Me too," I said softly, my gaze lingering on her profile. She looked at me then, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. The garden, the house, the distant hum of the cicadas, all of it faded into the background, leaving only her and the unspoken tension that hung between us. "Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About last night, you don't have to explain," I interrupted, my words tumbling out in a rush. "I mean, I get it. Things happen." She tilted her head, her gaze searching. "Do you get it humming?" I hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on me. Did I? All I knew was that the way she looked at me, the way her touch lingered longer than necessary, made my pulse race in a way I couldn't ignore. "I think so," I said finally, my voice quieter now. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something else, but instead she nodded, her hand brushing lightly against mine as she reached for another weed. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath hitch. The moment stretched, the silence between us filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. I wanted to ask her what she meant, what she felt, but the words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear and uncertainty. "I'm glad you're here," she said, suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a sincerity that made my chest tighten. "This house feels different, with you in it." "Different how?" I asked, my heart pounding. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting mine. "Lighter, like it's alive again." Her honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I feel it too," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Her smile deepened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, in a gesture so tender it made my breath catch. "You're a good man, Tom," she said softly, "more than you realize." The warmth of her touch, the softness of her voice, it was too much, and before I could think, I leaned closer, the distance between us shrinking, until I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. "Oh, Elaine?" I murmured, her name unfamiliar yet intimate on my lips. She didn't pull away. If anything, she moved closer, her eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my pulse thunder in my ears. "Tell me to stop," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "If this isn't what you want, tell me," but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. All I could do was close the remaining distance, my lips brushing against hers, in a kiss that was hesitant at first, testing the boundaries of what was allowed. But as the seconds passed, the kiss deepened, her fingers curling against the back of my neck as she pulled me closer. Time seemed to blur, the world narrowing to the press of her lips, the warmth of her touch. the way her body fit against mine, as though it had always been meant to. When we finally broke apart, her forehead rested lightly against mine, her breathing as uneven as my own. "This changes everything," she murmured, her voice filled with both wonder and fear. "I know," I said, my hand still resting on her waist, "but I don't want to go back." Her gaze softened, and she leaned in again, her lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture that was both reassuring and intimate. "Neither do I." The hours that followed passed in a haze, the garden forgotten as we found ourselves caught in a current we couldn't resist. We talked in hushed tones, our words interspersed with touches and glances that spoke of everything we couldn't say aloud. The unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally broken, leaving us raw, vulnerable, and irrevocably changed. By the time the sun began to set, the house felt different, warmer, more alive. Elaine stood in the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate as she prepared dinner, and I found myself watching her, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. She looked up, catching my gaze, and smiled. A soft, knowing smile that made my heart ache. "You're quiet," she said, her voice light, but filled with understanding. "Just thinking," I admitted. I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "About us, about what happens now." Her smile faded slightly, and she set down the knife she'd been holding, wiping her hands on a towel before stepping closer. "We take it one day at a time," she said softly, her fingers brushing against mine. "No expectations, no promises, just us." I nodded, her words settling over me like a balm. "I can do that." Her smile returned, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against my cheek. "Good," she murmured, "because I don't want to lose this. Or you." The next few days passed in a strange, delicate balance. Elaine and I slipped into an unspoken rhythm, one that felt simultaneously fragile and deeply natural. Mornings were filled with the quiet comfort of shared coffee, the silence broken by light conversation that never quite touched the undercurrent of what had begun between us. Afternoons stretched into moments where we found excuses to be near each other. A brush of hands in the hallway, her voice calling for my help in the garden, the way our gazes lingered a fraction too long. But nights were the hardest. Lying in my bed, the house silent around me, my thoughts refused to settle. I would replay every word, every glance, every touch, as though trying to understand something that defied logic. The memories of her laugh, the warmth of her hand on my arm, the way her lips had felt against mine, they filled my mind like a melody I couldn't forget. One night, as I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart leapt, my pulse quickening as I sat up, unsure if I had imagined it. The knock came again, quieter this time. Hesitate. I crossed the room and opened the door to find Elaine standing there, her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression unreadable in the dim light of the hallway. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She shook her head, her lips curving into a faint, rueful smile. "No. Can I come in?" I stepped aside, my chest tightening as she walked past me into the room. She moved to the window, her fingers brushing against the curtain as she stared out into the darkened yard. I watched her, unsure of what to say, the tension between us thick and palpable. "Tom," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've been trying to make sense of this. I leaned against the edge of the desk, my arms crossed, as I waited for her to continue. And? I prompted gently. She turned to face me, her eyes shadowed but filled with a raw honesty that made my breath catch. I can't, she admitted. All I know is that I don't want to stop feeling this. Feeling you. Her words hit me like a wave, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Ah, the vulnerability in her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. It broke something inside me. You don't have to, I said, finally, stepping closer. Neither of us does. Her gaze met mine, and I saw the flicker of fear and hope that mirrored my own. Tom, she began, her voice shaking slightly. This isn't supposed to happen. Maybe not, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But it is, and it feels real. She didn't respond, her silence stretching as she looked at me, her eyes searching for something I couldn't name. Then, slowly, she closed the distance between us, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on my chest. I don't want to hurt you, she whispered, her fingers curling against the fabric of my shirt. You won't, I promised, my hand covering hers. I trust you. Her breath hitched, and she tilted her head, her lips parting slightly, as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine as her hand slid up to cup the side of my face. Tell me to stop, she murmured, her voice trembling. If this is too much. I silenced her with a kiss, my hands moving to her waist as I pulled her closer. Her response was immediate, her arms wrapping around my neck as she pressed against me, her lips moving against mine with a hunger that matched my own. The world around us seemed to dissolve, leaving only the warmth of her body against mine, the quiet gasps that escaped her lips, the way her fingers threaded through my hair. We stumbled back toward the bed, the edge of the mattress catching us as we sank onto it. Her hands roamed over my shoulders, her touch sending sparks of electricity through me as I explored the curve of her back, the softness of her skin beneath my fingertips. Every kiss, every touch felt like a confession, an admission of everything we hadn't been able to say. When we finally pulled apart, our breathing ragged, she rested her head against my chest, her fingers tracing light patterns along my arm. This feels impossible, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. I pressed a kiss to her temple, my hand resting lightly on her back. It's not, I said softly, not if we want it. Her gaze lifted to meet mine, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I do, she admitted, her voice breaking. But I'm scared, Tom, of what this means, of what comes next. I cupped her face in my hands, my thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice steady. Together. She nodded, her smile faint but filled with a quiet determination. Together. The days that followed felt like a dream, fragile and fleeting, but impossibly vivid. We moved through the house with a newfound ease, the tension that had once defined our interactions replaced by something deeper, more intimate. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment felt like a promise, a reminder of the connection that had grown between us. But reality was never far away. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden, Elaine turned to me, her expression shadowed by uncertainty. Your father will be back soon, she said quietly. The weight of her words settled over me, and I nodded, the knot in my chest tightening. I know. Enabling, her fingers brushed against mine, her touch grounding. What we have, it doesn't change how much I love him," she said, her voice trembling. "But this, you, it's different." I met her gaze, my own emotions mirrored in her eyes. "I don't want to lose this," I admitted, my voice raw. "Neither do I," she said, her fingers tightening around mine. "But we have to be careful." I nodded, the reality of our situation pressing down on me. "We'll figure it out," I said, echoing the words I'd spoken before. Her smile returned, faint but filled with resolve. "Together," she said softly. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shades of amber and gold, and I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges we faced, I knew one thing for certain. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But in her presence, in the warmth of her touch, and the quiet strength of her gaze, I found something I hadn't known I was searching for. And in that moment, it was enough.